The grand ballroom glittered under 1,000 crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of roses and the hollow laughter of people who didn't care. Clara stood frozen in the center of it all, her fingers trembling as she stared at the towering birthday cake before her. 6 tiers of gold-dusted perfection, each layer a cruel reminder of what she lacked. 25 candles flickered, their flames dancing like the whispers behind her back. Poor little heiress, so rich, so alone. The words stung, but she'd learned long ago to swallow the pain. No one here was her friend. They were vultures in designer dresses, circling the fortune her last name promised. Her father? Busy sealing another deal, his back turned even on her birthday. The knife in her hand felt heavier than it should, the weight of every unanswered call, every broken promise pressing down on her chest. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and then she heard it. A voice. Low. Unfamiliar. You shouldn't have to blow those out alone. Clara's heart stopped. The room didn't. The orchestra played on, the champagne flowed, but the world around her blurred as she turned to find the source of those words. There, just beyond the crowd, stood a man she'd never seen before. No tuxedo, no polished smile, just a pair of honest eyes locked onto hers, as if he saw every crack in the mask she wore. Who was he? A staff member? A crasher? It didn't matter. Because for the first time in years, someone had seen her. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering against the marble floor. The music seemed to fade. The crowd dissolved. All that remained was the stranger's outstretched hand and a question hanging in the air. What happens when the one person who truly understands you is the one you least expect? This story isn't just about wealth or loneliness. It's about the moment everything changes. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, this is for you. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next part will leave you breathless. The stranger's voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp and unexpected, and Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her. The ballroom, with its gilded ceilings and murmurs of fake congratulations, suddenly felt like a cage. She had spent years perfecting the art of smiling through the ache, of nodding at jokes she didn't find funny, of pretending her father's absence didn't carve a hollow space inside her chest. But now, with those few words, you shouldn't have to blow those out alone. Something inside her fractured. The carefully constructed walls she'd built began to tremble. She turned fully toward him, her pulse hammering in her throat. He wasn't like the others. No tailored suit, no Rolex glinting under the chandeliers. His clothes were simple, his hands rough, as if he'd worked for every callus. A server? Maybe. But his gaze held hers with a confidence that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to blend into the background. The guests around them continued their charade, laughing too loudly, clinking glasses, oblivious to the storm brewing in the center of the room. Clara's breath hitched. No one had ever dared to speak to her like this. Not here, not in front of everyone. It was reckless. It was real. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between them, raw and unguarded. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened just slightly before he answered. "Someone who knows what it's like to stand in a room full of people and still feel like a ghost," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot, but there was a warmth there, something that made her want to lean in. Clara's fingers twisted in the fabric of her gown, the silk slipping through her grasp like sand. She wanted to look away, to retreat back into the safety of her polished indifference, but she couldn't. Because for the first time, someone was looking at her. Not her last name, not her bank account, but her. The orchestra swelled, the music swelling into a crescendo that felt like a mockery. Around them, the party went on, a whirlwind of laughter and lies. Clara's father was across the room, his back to her as always, deep in conversation with a man in a pinstripe suit. He hadn't even glanced her way since the toast he'd given earlier, a perfunctory speech about legacy and responsibility, his eyes already darting to his phone before the last word left his lips. She had stopped expecting more from him years ago, but the sting of it never faded. The stranger's eyes flickered toward the cake, then back to her. "You know, I used to think money could buy anything," he said, his tone low, intimate, as if they were the only two people in the world. "But some things can't be bought, like someone who actually sees you." The words landed like a punch. Clara felt her chest tighten. She had spent her life surrounded by people, yet she had never felt more alone than in that moment, standing in the center of her own birthday party, invisible to everyone but this man she didn't even know. A laugh bubbled up in her throat, bitter and broken. "You don't know me," she said. But even as the words left her lips, she realized how hollow they sounded. Because he did know. Not her name, not her story, but the part of her that mattered, the part that was drowning in the emptiness of it all. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached out, just slightly, as if testing the space between them. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to be surrounded by everything and still feel like you're starving." The honesty in his voice was almost unbearable. Clara's vision blurred, the lights of the ballroom bleeding into streaks of gold and white. She blinked rapidly, willing herself not to cry. Not here, not now. But the dam was cracking and she wasn't sure she could hold it back much longer. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The question was bigger than the moment, bigger than the party. It was the question she'd been asking herself for years. Why was she here? What was the point of all this? The wealth, the prestige, the endless cycle of events where no one truly cared, if she was still so utterly alone. The stranger hesitated, his gaze dropping to the cake again. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "the universe puts you exactly where you're supposed to be." Clara's heart stuttered. It was a ridiculous thing to say, too poetic, too convenient. And yet, she believed him. Because in that instant, with his hand almost brushing hers, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope meant risking more than she could afford to lose. Before she could respond, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. Clara flinched, turning to see her father's assistant, his smile sharp as a knife. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice slick with false warmth. "Your father would like a word." His eyes flicked to the stranger, dismissive and cold. Alone. The spell shattered. The noise of the party rushed back in, the laughter and clinking glasses suddenly deafening. Clara felt the stranger's presence retreat, just slightly, as if he were giving her a choice. Stay with him, or follow the script she'd been handed at birth. She looked up at him one last time, her throat tight. He gave her the smallest nod, as if to say, "I'm still here." And then she was being led away, her father's assistant's grip firm on her arm. She didn't look back. But she could still feel the stranger's eyes on her, burning into her skin like a brand. The cake remained untouched, the candles still flickering, their flames casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. Clara's mind raced. Who was he? Why had he come? And why did it feel like her entire life had been leading up to this moment? As she was pulled into the sea of guests, the stranger's words echoed in her mind. You shouldn't have to blow those out alone. For the first time, she wondered if she didn't have to. If maybe, just maybe, she could choose a different path. But the weight of her father's expectations pressed down on her, heavy and unyielding. Could she really walk away from everything she'd ever known? And if she did, what would be left? Clara's heels sank into the plush carpet as she was steered toward her father, each step feeling like she was being dragged deeper into a life that wasn't hers. The assistant's grip was polite but unyielding, his smile never wavering as he navigated her through the crowd with practiced ease. "Your father's been looking for you," he murmured, his voice laced with that same false warmth that made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream. She wanted to turn around and run back to the stranger, to demand answers, to beg him to tell her why he'd appeared now, of all times. But she didn't. Because Clara Harcourt had spent a lifetime learning how to be invisible, even when all eyes were on her. Her father stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette sharp against the city lights sprawled below. He didn't turn as she approached, his attention fixed on the man beside him. A potential investor, no doubt. Someone whose approval mattered more than his own daughter's birthday. Clara stopped a few feet away, her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze still lingering on her back, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "Clara," her father finally acknowledged, his voice distracted. He glanced at her, his eyes flickering over her dress, her posture, as if assessing her for flaws. "You remember Mr. Langley, he's interested in our new development project in Dubai." Mr. Langley turned, his smile wide and practiced. "Of course, the famous Clara Harcourt," he said, extending a hand. "Your father speaks very highly of you." She forced a smile, her fingers cold as she shook his hand. Liar, she thought. Her father had never spoken highly of her to anyone. She was a prop, a name to drop in conversations, a way to humanize the Harcourt empire. Nothing more. "Clara," her father continued, his tone shifting into something firmer, more commanding. "Mr. Langley was just asking about the charity gala next month. You'll be attending, of course." It wasn't a question. It was an order. Clara's stomach twisted. The gala was just another event, another night of smiling until her cheeks ached, of nodding along to conversations she didn't care about. Another night of being seen but never known. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Her father gave her a curt nod before turning back to Mr. Langley, dismissing her as quickly as he'd summoned her. Clara stood there for a moment, her breath shallow, her mind racing. She could see the stranger out of the corner of her eye, still watching her, waiting. She excused herself before her father could call her back, her pulse roaring in her ears as she slipped away from the group. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. From the noise, from the expectations, from the suffocating weight of being Clara Harcourt. She found herself near the balcony doors, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. Outside, the city sparkled, indifferent to the turmoil inside her. "You look like you're about to jump." The voice came from behind her, low and steady. She turned to find the stranger leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart leapt. She hadn't even heard him approach. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About what?" He pressed, stepping closer. She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. Not like this. Not like they actually wanted to know. About how easy it would be to just walk away from all of this, she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The stranger didn't laugh. He didn't tell her she was being dramatic. He just nodded, as if he understood completely. "And what's stopping you?" Clara's breath hitched. It was a question she'd asked herself 1,000 times, but hearing it from him made it feel real, dangerous. "Everything," she said finally. "My father. The company. The life I'm supposed to live." "Supposed to," he repeated, his voice soft. "But not the one you want to live." She looked away, her vision blurring. She couldn't answer that, because if she did, if she admitted the truth out loud, she wasn't sure she could go back to pretending. The stranger reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, just for a second. It was enough to send a jolt through her, like a spark in the dark. "What if I told you there's another way?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the party. Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to grab his hand and run, to leave this life behind and never look back. But fear held her rooted in place. "What if it's too late?" she whispered. The stranger's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "It's never too late," he said fiercely. "But you have to choose. Right now. Because if you walk back into that room, if you let them pull you back in, you might never find your way out again." Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, heavier than any expectation her father had ever placed on her shoulders. The party continued behind her, the laughter and music a cruel contrast to the silence between them. She looked into the stranger's eyes and saw something there, something raw and real and terrifyingly honest. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he took her hand, his grip warm and sure. "You trust me," he said simply. And in that moment, Clara realized she already did. But as she took a step toward him, toward the unknown, a shadow fell across them. Clara turned to see her father standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes locked onto their joined hands, and the air between them turned to ice. "Clara," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Who is this?" The stranger's grip tightened, just slightly. Clara's mind raced. She could lie. She could make up some excuse, smooth things over like she always did. But as she looked at her father, really looked at him, she realized something. She didn't want to, not anymore. She opened her mouth to speak, but the stranger beat her to it. "Someone who's about to change everything," he said, his voice steady, his gaze never leaving her father's. The room seemed to hold its breath. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. She was ready for it. What would you do if you had to choose between the life you were born into and the one you truly wanted? Let me know in the comments. Because Clara's choice is about to change everything. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with the crystal champagne flute scattered across the room. Clara's father stood rigid, his eyes narrowing as he took in the stranger's defiant stance, his hand still wrapped around Clara's. She could see the storm brewing behind his carefully controlled expression, the clenched jaw, the flicker of something dark in his gaze. This wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. And for the first time in her life, Clara didn't care. "Change everything?" her father repeated, his voice low, dangerous. The party around them might as well have vanished. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a distant hum, drowned out by the pounding of Clara's heart. She had spent her entire life trying to earn her father's approval, bending herself into whatever shape he demanded. But now, with the stranger's fingers intertwined with hers, she felt something she hadn't in years. Courage. "Yes," the stranger said, his voice unwavering. "She deserves more than this." Her father's laugh was sharp, humorless. "And you think you can give it to her?" he scoffed. "You don't even know who she is, who we are." The stranger didn't flinch. "I know enough," he said. "I know she's spent her life trapped in a gilded cage. I know she's lonely. And I know she's stronger than you've ever given her credit for." Clara's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her father like this. No one had ever dared. But the stranger wasn't just anyone. There was a fire in his eyes, a conviction that made her believe, even if just for a second, that he could actually pull her out of this life. Her father's gaze snapped to her, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "Clara," he said, his voice a warning, "step away from him now." She didn't move. For a heartbeat, no one did. The tension in the air was electric, the kind that precedes a storm. Clara could feel the weight of every eye in the room on them, the whispers already starting to ripple through the crowd. But she didn't care about the scandal. She didn't care about the consequences. All she cared about was the way the stranger's hand felt in hers. Steady, real, alive. "Who are you?" her father demanded, his voice rising. The stranger hesitated just for a second. Then he squared his shoulders and met her father's glare head-on. "Someone who remembers her mother," he said quietly. Clara's world tilted. Her mother. The words hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't heard anyone speak about her mother in years, not like this, not with such raw, unfiltered emotion. Her father's face paled, his composure cracking for the first time in Clara's memory. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. But there was a tremor in his voice now, a flicker of something that looked almost like fear. The stranger's grip on her hand tightened. "I knew her before she married you," he said. "Before the money, before the empire, before all of this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, his lip curling in disgust. "She was kind. She was happy. and she would have wanted more for Clara than this. Clara's vision blurred. Her mother had died when she was 10, and in the years since, her father had made sure her memory was polished into something safe, something controlled. A portrait on the wall, a name on a charity wing. But this was different. This was real. "You're lying," her father said, but the conviction was gone from his voice. "Am I?" The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Clara's breath hitched as he handed it to her. It was her mother, younger than Clara had ever seen her, laughing in the sun, her hair wild, her eyes bright. And standing beside her, arms slung around her shoulders, was the stranger. Younger too, but unmistakably him. Clara's fingers trembled as she traced the edges of the photo. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "She gave it to me," he said softly. "The summer before she met your father. We were friends, good friends." His voice cracked, just slightly. "She used to talk about the life she wanted, a simple one, full of love, not this." He waved a hand at the ballroom, at the sea of indifferent faces. Clara's throat tightened. She had spent so long believing her mother would have wanted this life for her, the wealth, the status, the Harcourt name. But looking at the photo, at the genuine joy on her mother's face, she realized how wrong she'd been. Her father's face darkened. "Enough," he said, his voice a whip crack. "Security will escort you out." The stranger didn't resist as two burly men in black suits stepped forward, their expressions impassive, but his eyes never left Clara's. "It's not too late," he said, his voice urgent. "You can still walk away. You can still choose you." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the eyes of the party on her, feel the weight of her father's expectations pressing down on her. But for the first time, she also felt something else, possibility. She turned to her father, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to hear what he has to say." Her father's expression twisted. "Clara," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't do this." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not a child anymore," she said. "I'm not your puppet, and I'm done living a life that isn't mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Her father's face contorted with rage, but before he could speak, Clara turned and walked toward the stranger. Her chin lifted. The crowd parted around them, the whispers growing louder, but she didn't look back. Not even when her father called her name, his voice raw with something that almost sounded like desperation. The stranger led her through the ballroom, his hand warm against hers. She could feel the eyes on them, the shock rippling through the room, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way her heart raced, the way the air felt lighter with every step she took away from the life she'd known. They slipped out a side door, into a quiet hallway lined with portraits of Harcourt ancestors. Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her mind racing. She had no idea what came next. She had no plan, no safety net. But for the first time in her life, she felt free. The stranger stopped in front of a window, the city lights stretching out below them. "I know this is a lot," he said, his voice gentle. "But I promise you, Clara, there's a whole world out there. One where you don't have to be lonely. One where you can be you." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the honesty in his eyes. She thought of the photo, of her mother's laughter, of the life she'd been too afraid to imagine. And she knew, with a certainty that stole her breath, that she was making the right choice. But as she opened her mouth to speak, the door behind them burst open. Clara turned to see her father standing there, his face a mask of cold fury. "You think you can just walk away?" he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You think it's that simple?" The stranger stepped in front of her, shielding her. "She's not your property," he said, his voice firm. "She's a person, and she deserves to be happy." Her father's laugh was bitter. "Happy?" he spat. "You have no idea what happiness costs." Clara's hands clenched into fists. She was done being silent. She was done being afraid. "Then tell me," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong. "Tell me what it costs, because I'm willing to pay it." The air between them crackled with tension, the kind that comes before a storm. When the wind dies, the sky darkens, and you know nothing will ever be the same. Clara's father stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and something else, something that looked almost like pain. For a second, Clara thought she saw a flicker of the man he might have been before power hardened him into stone. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze she knew too well. "You have no idea what you're giving up," he said, his voice low and lethal. The words were meant to cut, to make her doubt, to remind her of everything she stood to lose. But Clara didn't flinch. She was done being his pawn. "I know exactly what I'm leaving behind," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "A life where I'm a ghost in my own story. A name on a contract, a smile in a photograph." She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "I'd rather have nothing than spend another day pretending this is enough." The stranger's hand found hers again, his touch grounding her. Her father's gaze flicked to their joined hands, his jaw tightening. "You'll regret this," he said, but the threat lacked its usual bite. For the first time, Clara saw the cracks in his armor. He wasn't just angry, he was scared. "Maybe," she admitted, "but at least it'll be my regret, not yours." Her father's face twisted. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice rough. "He doesn't know you. He doesn't know what this world is like. He can't protect you from it." The stranger didn't let her respond. "She doesn't need protecting," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "She needs to live." Clara's breath hitched. No one had ever defended her like this. No one had ever stood between her and her father's wrath. The realization sent a rush of something fierce and bright through her veins. Grit, maybe, or hope. Her father's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you think you can offer her?" he sneered. "A life of struggling, of scraping by. You think that's what she wants?" Clara opened her mouth to answer, but the stranger beat her to it. "I'm offering her a choice," he said. "Something you never did." The words hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Clara's father recoiled as if he'd been struck. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something quickly, tore out the check, and thrust it toward Clara. "Fine," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Take it all. But don't come crawling back when you realize how good you had it." Clara didn't even glance at the check. "I don't want your money," she said. Her father's face darkened. "Then what do you want?" She looked at the stranger, at the honesty in his eyes, at the way he stood beside her like an equal, not a guardian or a keeper. "I want to be happy," she said simply. "Even if it's hard, even if it's messy, I want to feel something real." Her father's hand clenched into a fist, crumpling the check. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said. But the conviction was gone. He was losing her, and he knew it. Clara didn't wait for him to say another word. She turned and walked toward the elevator, the stranger beside her. She could feel her father's gaze burning into her back, could hear the sharp intake of breath from the few staff members who had gathered in the hallway. But she didn't look back. Not when he called her name, not when his voice cracked with something that might have been desperation. She pressed the elevator button, her fingers trembling, and stepped inside as the doors slid open. The moment they closed, the noise of the party, the weight of her father's expectations, the suffocating pressure of the Harcourt name, it all vanished. For the first time in her life, Clara felt like she could breathe. The stranger didn't speak as the elevator descended. He didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances or grand promises. He just stood beside her, his presence steady, his hand warm in hers. When the doors opened into the lobby, Clara hesitated. The outside world waited beyond the glass doors, bright, unknown, terrifying. "You don't have to do this," the stranger said softly. "If you're not ready—" She turned to him, her heart pounding. "I am ready," she said. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." He studied her for a long moment, as if searching for doubt in her eyes. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because he nodded and led her toward the exit. The night air hit her like a wake-up call, cool and sharp. Clara took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of rain and city lights. She had no plan, no safety net, no idea what came next. But she had never felt so alive. They walked in silence for a few blocks, the city humming around them. Clara's mind raced with questions. Where would she go? What would she do? How would she survive without the Harcourt name? But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't terrify her. It excited her. The stranger stopped in front of a small, dimly lit cafe tucked between two towering skyscrapers. The kind of place Clara had passed 100 times, but never noticed. "This is where I work," he said, pushing open the door. A bell chimed overhead, and the rich scent of coffee and fresh bread wrapped around her like a hug. A woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "You're late," she said, but her tone was warm. Then her gaze landed on Clara, and her eyebrows shot up. "Well, aren't you a sight?" Clara self-consciously smoothed her designer gown, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look. But the woman just laughed. "Don't worry, honey. We don't bite." She grabbed an apron from under the counter and tossed it to Clara. "Here, if you're sticking around, you might as well earn your keep." Clara caught the apron, her fingers curling around the rough fabric. She looked at the stranger, her heart in her throat. "You want me to work here?" He grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Only if you want to. But I figure if you're going to start over, you might as well start now." Clara's hands trembled as she tied the apron around her waist. She had never worked a day in her life. She had no idea how to make coffee, how to take orders, how to do any of this. But as she looked around the cozy cafe, at the laughter of the customers, at the way the stranger moved behind the counter with easy confidence, she felt something unfold inside her. Something that felt like belonging. The first customer of the night, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit, approached the counter. Clara's pulse spiked, but she squared her shoulders and smiled. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice only slightly unsteady. The man ordered a black coffee, no sugar. Clara fumbled with the machine, her hands clumsy, but the stranger guided her through it, his patience never wavering. When she finally handed the man his coffee, he took a sip and nodded. "Not bad, rookie," he said with a wink. Clara laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. As the night wore on, Clara's nerves melted away. She burned her fingers on the espresso machine, spilled sugar on the counter, and laughed more than she had in years. The customers were kind, the work was hard, and by the time the cafe closed, her feet ached and her apron was stained with coffee and flour. But as she wiped down the tables, her mind was clear for the first time in as long as she could remember. The stranger leaned against the counter, watching her. "So?" he asked. "Still think you made the right choice?" Clara looked around the cafe at the mess they'd made, at the life she was stepping into. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was hers. She met his gaze and smiled. "Best choice I ever made." Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky. Somewhere out there, her father was probably rage texting her. Her old life was crumbling, and the world as she knew it was changing forever. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because for the first time, Clara wasn't just existing, she was living. The cafe door chimed softly as the last customer left, leaving Clara and the stranger alone in the quiet glow of the overhead lights. The night had been a whirlwind. Her hands still trembled from the rush of learning, of living. But as she leaned against the counter, she felt something settle inside her. A quiet certainty. This was where she was meant to be. The stranger wiped down the espresso machine, his movements slow and deliberate. "You did good tonight," he said, glancing at her with a warmth in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Clara laughed, shaking her head. "I spilled coffee on 3 people and nearly set a muffin on fire," she admitted. But she couldn't stop smiling, because for the first time, her mistakes didn't feel like failures. They felt like proof she was finally alive. He chuckled, tossing the rag onto the counter. "Everyone starts somewhere. Then his expression softened. "Your father's not going to stop trying to pull you back, you know." Clara's smile faded just slightly. She knew he was right. Her father wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. He would call, he would threaten, he would use every weapon in his arsenal to drag her back into the gilded cage she'd just escaped. But she also knew something else. She wasn't the same person who had stood in that ballroom, drowning in loneliness. She wasn't going back. "I know," she said quietly, "but I'm not his anymore." The stranger studied her for a long moment, as if searching for doubt. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because he nodded and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small worn key and pressed it into her palm. "This is for the apartment above the cafe," he said. "It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. No strings, no expectations." Clara's fingers closed around the key, her throat tightening. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a penthouse with a view of the city. But it was hers, a place to start over, a place to be free. She looked up at him, her vision blurring. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why did you do all this?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I made a promise a long time ago," he said, his voice rough, "to your mother, that if I ever had the chance, I'd make sure you got the life she wanted for you." Clara's breath hitched. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy. All this time she'd thought she was alone, but she wasn't. She never had been. She stepped closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. What was she like? Really? The stranger's eyes softened, his gaze distant as he remembered. "She was kind," he said. "Funny. She had this laugh that could light up a room, and she loved you more than anything in this world." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Clara's ear. "She would have been so proud of you tonight." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, let herself feel the grief and the joy and the overwhelming relief of finally being seen. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything." He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled her into a hug, his arms strong and sure around her. Clara buried her face in his shoulder, letting herself cry for the first time in years. Not for the life she'd lost, but for the one she was finally brave enough to claim. When she pulled back, the stranger handed her a folded piece of paper. "Your mother wrote this for you," he said. "She asked me to give it to you when you were ready." Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's. Elegant, looping, full of love. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means you found the courage to choose yourself. And that's the bravest thing you'll ever do. Life isn't about the money, the name, or the expectations others place on you. It's about the moments that make your heart race, the people who make you feel alive, and the love that fills you up when everything else feels empty. Don't ever let anyone dim your light. You are so much more than they'll ever see. I love you. Always. Mom." Clara's vision blurred as she read the words, her mother's voice echoing in her mind as if she were standing right there. She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of it, of her, settle into her bones. She wasn't just Clara Harcourt, the heiress, the puppet, the girl who smiled and nodded and never made waves. She was Clara. Just Clara. And that was enough. The stranger watched her, his expression soft. "She loved you so much," he said, "and she'd want you to be happy. No matter what that looks like." Clara took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She looked around the cafe, at the worn tables, the chipped mugs, the life she was choosing, and felt a surge of determination. "I am happy," she said. "For the first time in my life, I am." Outside, the city pulsed with energy, indifferent to the storm she'd just weathered. Somewhere, her father was probably plotting his next move. Her old life was crumbling, and the world was changing, but none of it mattered. Because Clara wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She wasn't waiting for someone to tell her she was worthy. She was taking her life into her own hands, and she was never letting go. She turned to the stranger, her heart full. "What happens now?" He smiled, the kind of smile that made her believe in second chances. Now, he said, now we live. If Clara's story touched you, if you've ever felt trapped by expectations or longed for the courage to choose yourself, click like and subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning. The journey to freedom is confusing, beautiful, and full of twists and turns. Comment below, what would you do if you had the chance to start over? We'll bring you more moving stories. See you in the next video.